Okay lah, I think we will start. Good morning, and thank you for being super early and super on time, even though we are super late. For the first session for the IGF, it is always going to be a difficult one. We always anticipate registration and so on, and today is an additional fun challenge of the snow. I'm guessing people will trickle in, but otherwise I think if we sort of keep waiting, we will probably run out of time. So, welcome. Welcome to this session that has a very long name, which I actually don't even remember myself. Let me see. What is it called? There you go. To the session on body as data, data valence, the informatization of the body and citizenship. My name is Jack. I am with the Association for Progressive Communications. We are a network-based organization working on a range of issues on ICTs and social justice, and I head the Women's Rights Program, and we do a lot of work around gender and sexuality and the internet. So we have with us here three discussants. This IGF, this is probably going to be a recurring experience for you throughout this IGF, and actually probably not just this IGF, probably many IGFs, where speakers constantly change, actually. So we apologize if you were here hoping to hear from Katja, Jeanette, or Ralph, because Jeanette can't make it, neither could Katja, and Ralph didn't respond. But nonetheless, we have three excellent discussants anyway who's done really interesting research work in this area around data, around big data, around decision-making based on big data and the implications and the intersection on this onto a body that is gendered and, on the intersections between gender and sexuality and the body. So we have with us Valentina Pelitza, who heads Erotics, which is a research network on sexuality and the internet. It's a research network that began in 2008 and has expanded and also deepened in various areas, and now it is looking at research on sexuality and the internet, particularly in South Asia. And then we have Bishaka Datta, who is who's been doing a whole range of work and really sort of pushing this envelope around thinking about the intersection between media, disability, sexuality, as well as internet rights. And she is with Point of View. And then we have Vidushi Marda, who is a legal policy analyst and researcher, and also a huge geek on AI and AI ethics, and is interested in this very interesting intersection as well between data law and how this impacts on social and political and cultural life. So let's. So as a little bit of an introduction, I guess we are at the moment almost like living in an age of data, where we are driving towards more and more decision making that is being informed and driven by data. It's almost like, and also this is something which is a project by civil society. We've always been asking for data-driven policy, and we did not want policy that is being just done based on assumptions and biases. However, this is now creating kind of a little bit of problematics to us in new and different ways, because the problems with data is, I suppose, threefold. One is the issue of invisibility, so not being seen in data sets, not being counted, and therefore not even sort of existing. The second is actually the problem of hypervisibility. So you are being too seen because your data set or the representation of your particular group is somehow deviant or problematic and therefore hypervisible. This is something that is a very familiar experience for people who traditionally face discrimination in society, for example, because of their race, ethnicity, gender expressions, or because of the occupation that they have, for example, sex workers, or even populations of people like migrants or refugees. So there is also this problem of hypervisibility. And then thirdly is, of course, this very familiar problem of bias, where the data set is simply somehow incorporating within it some level of pre-existing bias that exists in society, whether this is in terms of who is asking the question and therefore whose perspectives it is, to what end or value is this question, so what are we trying to what are we trying to be able to understand based on asking this question? How is the data collected? Who is collecting the data? How are then particular data sets assembled to make bigger data sets? And how and who are decisions being made based on these data sets? And traditionally, we assume that the how and who are people, right? Policymakers who will then look at this data, blah, 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 sort of consider, make particular adjustments for biases and so on in the ideal situation. But in the age of artificial intelligence and machine learning as well, now we are in a situation where maybe it's not even, like, you cannot even sort of rely on this already problematic kind of agency of decision-making by particular human beings. So here we are in this moment. And what we've discovered as well, having worked with primarily women human rights defenders, activists working on sexuality, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and a range of other issues, as well as LGBTQ populations, so queer communities, is that it's actually really difficult to do research in this area. It's difficult to do research in this area primarily because those who are collecting huge amounts of data are privatized entities, and those who are actually also processing this data are privatized entities. And then you enter into issues of some of these algorithms being trade secrets. And yesterday, Sunil Abraham had this wonderful quote in Discotech, and he was saying, you know, now the machines have become so complicated that they are not able to explain how they work. So we have to hack them. So a lot of this hacking research is being done in some way, sort of like reverse engineering. We see the outcome, we roll back, or we see data sets, and then we try and see vulnerabilities within that. But yeah, within this kind of curious situation of being in a very, very data-driven policy decision-making age, the difficulty and challenges of doing research around this, especially if you are from civil society and that your primary concern is about looking at human rights impact to particularly at-risk or marginalized communities, and trying to then be able to orientate this towards these are some of the things that we need to pay attention to. This is where the panel aims to share with you some level of research that's been done in this area, and to also invite you. I think we are here in this room for a reason, like we probably have an interest and curiosity in this, and to also sort of invite you to share your thoughts, your work, and your kind of like questions around this as well. Really, this room is very awkwardly organized, so it feels very like, you know, you versus us. But hopefully we can have a much more like conversational thing happening for the remaining of the 1 hour. And consider this really an open invitation to really share your thoughts and your insights on this issue as well. So let me begin by inviting Valentina to yeah?
Yes. Morning. Okay, this is a very linear presentation to help following when we talk about numbers, percentages, and things. And it's based on the global surveys that we have done as part of the erotics. The presentation is online, so don't bother. So you have already heard what is erotic. I will not stop on this. What is important, that is an exploration, but it's also a network. So there are real people that come from different parts of the world and that want to understand, see, and make change. So why data is relevant? Data are all these bits of the selves of who we are, which are transferred, stored, exported, meshed up, morphed. And there is attached to them joy, but also a continuous attempt to try to secure them because they can be lost or they can be reused. So just to have this idea of us, this body in flesh and bone, and this idea is also of us that is done by bit, that then, travel around the ether and then come back again in the form of an image, a text, a representation, a story. As we have done a small issue paper that it's called Big Data, and gender surveillance that can be interesting. And there are 4 concepts that I think are relevant for our conversation. One, about big data, because we don't talk about the little data each of us has, but we talk about the big data that are put together from the millions of people that interact. And those are data set that contains everything. So I will not read again the definition, but those are just to set a common ground. So data set that contains social media data, machine data, transactional data, any kind of data, because we live in a world that surveil us all over the time. We walk, and there are machines that take, if we pass a shop, there is a CCTV. If we stop, if we enter in a bank, there is a CCTV. If we do transaction, there are our data. So it's just this body that walk with all the data, and those data come together. And then the metadata, the invisible bits that people know are there, know that serves to identify, but you cannot touch. And what is data valence? And this is when all these data have their own languages, they come together and then can be used to do surveillance. So it's important to combine the 2 things, the data and the surveillance, because surveillance very often it's related with a specific mood, it's as a tradition. So it's not so much about creating new jargon, but just highlight and make invisible what is the means of surveillance. And maybe sometimes it's just the end of the surveillance itself. And assemblage, because again, how we package. The packages is important. How things are put together is important. Make a difference. And there are all these institutions that collect and that come together. So those 4, let's say, this definition as 4 main concepts around big data and data that are relevant to us. So the survey. The global surveys happened for 3rd time. The first 2 times, its purpose is very simple, is to map the use of sexual rights activists, and this is a very wide spectrum. It goes from women's rights, gender rights advocates, LGBTIQ population, people that are invested in reproductive rights at large, and to document types of risk, content regulation, censorship, and also the response and strategy. We usually don't stop at the dark side of the story. We try also to see how people react, what are the strategies, and also what is the joy when you are in the internet. The internet at the beginning was a place of joy, and it's probably still a place of joy where people experiment about a self as pleasure, entertain, and is entertained. And then look at the policy question that this space also highlights. This survey was focusing on sexual expression. So what are the means of sexual expression? And what are the situations of surveillance, censorship, and online harassment and resistance strategy? So this survey, it's like giving you an experience, how people are on the internet, specific people, activists, and what is their experience of the survey. So we'll not tell you all the stories of the hidden layer, what connects the data and the experience of the people, but set a ground. And it's important that we remember that there are lived experience, because then we can abstract ourselves and forget that there are real people suffering really consequences or enjoying victories. So our demographic, we have 332 respondents, and the 86% of the respondents define themselves as cis women and cis men. We had a little number of trans and intersex population, 20 cases. That's why we also thought that it's not relevant and would not be fair to have them in percentages, but just to highlight. This is a community that is present online, but it's really difficult to capture. There is the issue of the language, there is the issue of ability and availability, how you can reach out, how can you use the means of an online survey to respond and provide your data. But I will not enter now in the specificity of this. So this is just to see the majority of the respondents are LGBTQ, and the reason why intersex people and trans people are not there just because they were a small number. And this is important for us because this is the community that we try to tell the story of, or to talk together, and to say what and to see what is their experience and their strategies. The age. Majority, the overwhelming majority, 74%, are between 18 and 39 years old, and just 15% is between 40 and 49. I just will go fast. 81% people suffer kind of discrimination, and the main form of discrimination are related with social class and caste, then ethnicity, color of skin, and sexual orientation. And those are multiple discrimination. There is the little word about intersectionality. Intersectionality, we can intersect privilege, but we also intersect discrimination. So it's important to understand that the community that we are talking about as this experience while online. And what is interesting, we asked why you are online and what you do when you are online, professionally and personally. And as you see, people are really consistent. LGBTIQ activists are there to pursue their right. They use the internet as a space to raise their voice, to affirm their rights, and to change, I would say, the world. The same is happened for women's rights and sexual health. Those are the main area of engagement, I would say. And as you see, people are not there online just for surfing and looking. They share information. They search for information. They create and do public action, look for dialogue, and also to network, to build together. And as you see, just a small percent, 2% says the internet, not good enough for what I do. This is about the use. What are the tools? As you see, it's very colored, and there are many options. Here I try to make some of the highlights. So 98% of people use social networks. And it's important for us to understand what social network means. This specific public space that is a private space owned by someone. 92% use instant messaging and email. 89% website, blogs, and hosting service. And what are these instant messaging, email, and social network that people mainly use? WhatsApp. It's used by the 90% of our respondents. And then 37% messages. They both belong to the same corporation. Email, 87% is using Gmail. Social network, 94% is on Facebook. Facebook is the site of their politics, of their life. So from pleasure to politics happening there in a specific place. And the threat. 75% of the respondents had experienced harassment. And then there are, of course, different degrees. 63% intimidating online comments. So whenever you say something that is different from what is perceived as the norm, this is the reaction. And 54 had experienced some blocked website, filtering software, something that prevent them from accessing the information that they were looking for. And if you remember, majority of people is looking for information and for sharing information. And Africa is the region where this is most happening. The majority of our respondents are from Africa, Latin America. We didn't have really responded and was not our main area of interest, North Europe or US. So it's really a small percentage of voices, but from what is called the Global South. And this is the perception that people have. This is their experience. Who has power over their sexual expression? Who can influence, limit, and mod? People think 66% come from government and state, 64% from internet providers, 40% from peers. And we should ask ourselves, who give peers so much power to see so much about us so that they can be so targeting, so specific, and so effective when they want to silence or to intimidate or to harass? And 43% of people says that they felt that social media, they had been followed, something that made them uncomfortable. Because people cannot sometimes say exactly what, but this is between the bad experience or the uncomfortable experience and the effect. This is what is the people experience. So someone is watching us. And the strategy. The majority technical responses, which is mainly strengthening your privacy setting. We should think that those are individual responses, a small community that empower and tell each other how to protect or be more secure. 48% has non-confrontational solution. Non-confrontational goes from not say anything and being silenced to just disappear from the social network. So unlog or just delete your own account. and 29% had engaged in form of political or social strategies to try to counter-react and create an alternative narrative. So I stop here. This is just to give you a sense of how LGBTIQ people and women's rights advocates perceive and live this sense of being surveilled. And there is this linkage, this hidden. It's like a submarine cable between the experience of the people and the data, which is how translate on the internet or in the digital our experience, our words becomes data. And so what are the connections? What make this surveillance so effective? And how to change, how to be part of the conversation of what Jack was saying at the beginning. How to move in this hypervisibility that is usually to highlight the deviancy, to be part of a conversation and then to annul or make evident the bias and come back in a situation where rights are asserted.
Thanks, Valentina. And you brought some kind of interesting questions there about impact and value and sort of like the missing link, no? And I was particularly struck by the 43% who realizes some level of awareness is happening, but not quite sure who, what, where, when, how, but just kind of knowing that it's, but what about the other 60, what is my maths, huh? 57% who's kind of like, meh, okay, meh, surveillance. Oh well. So that's also like kind of an interesting moment of, I guess, existential living. Let's move to Bishaka and yeah.
I'll move. Hello, can you hear me through the mic? Okay, super. Okay, I live in India, in Mumbai, and how can I make this full screen? Sorry. Yeah. Try. Because I use a Mac, so I'm not so familiar with
the full screen.
Yeah.
Can't see it. Try to
This?
Yeah.
This one. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So I live in Mumbai, India, and our organization recently did a study which is based on data, and I'm going to take you through one small part of the study because I think it throws up really interesting questions on the relationship between bodies and data. So first, just to introduce, my talk is going to be called The Pervert and the Sexual Freak, which are two of the categories that sort of came out in this data set or that were produced by this data set. And the research itself is a study that looks at one aspect of the Information Technology Act in India, which was an act that came in 2000 and basically deals with all internet or digital related offenses. We studied one section of this act, which is called Section 67, or the provision that deals with what is called digital obscenity. And just very, very briefly, the language in the act is pretty much the same language in the act that deals with sort of physical obscenity in the Indian Penal Code, which is language that came in 1860. In colonial times, when our penal code came into existence, and frankly, at a time when we didn't even have film and video, let alone the internet, right? So it's a very archaic definition of obscenity to begin with, which talks about obscenity as something that is either lascivious or prurient or depraves and corrupts, and is, of course, all these four words are inherently subjective and vague and leave a great deal of judicial discretion. But that is not the direction that I actually want to go in today. What I want to talk about is one piece of our research actually looked at one of the biggest data sets in India related to crime. and that is produced by a government agency called the National Crime Records Bureau. The National Crime Records Bureau is essentially empowered through an act of parliament for the last, say, 45 years or so, to basically gather data on all crimes that take place in India. And these are then collated every year and produced in a volume that is called Crime in India. So the image that I have up here is for the cover of Crime in India 2015. And this is a volume that is essentially just statistics. So there are 20 chapters of statistics. Crimes are subclassified, and chapter 18 is the one that deals with what are called cyber crimes by the, or crimes under the Information Technology Act. So one of the things is, when we were doing this research, this is public data. This is available on the National Crime Records Bureau website every year. And this is actually used by journalists and media in India to extensively talk about patterns in crime, right? So is sexual violence going up? Are thefts going up, etc.? And a lot of the data is actually taken at face value. At the same time, what we are seeing is that academics and statisticians are really questioning the value of this kind of data simply because this data is collected from different states in India, and in that sense, data is political, because states also have incentives to underreport data, to show that the states are crime-free, or that they're doing a good job of governance, etc., etc. So I think the first point I wanted to make is that data is political, no matter how it's generated, and we cannot take it at face value. And I think this became really evident to us when we were looking at this particular section, which is section 67 and a chapter 18 of the Crimes in India thing. So one of the things we found which was really interesting is that there is a huge discrepancy in the way the National Crime Records Bureau records data related to all other crimes and cybercrime. So for example, out of the 20 chapters, in 19 chapters which do not deal with internet-related offenses, there is just statistical data that is collated. How many crimes were committed, how many arrests were made, how many cases are still pending, convictions, etc. But when it comes to cybercrime, there were two additional categories that have been added on. One is, for the first time, and this is up here, is there is a table which is called 18.7, and this actually tries to categorize crime according to the motives. Now, if you just look at this, you'll see that just a very casual glance, looking at things like some of the motives are personal revenge, settling scores, emotional motives, greed, financial gain, extortion, causing disrepute, insult to the modesty of women, which is again archaic language for sexual harassment in India, right? Yeah, because we have a law under the Indian Penal Code, which is sort of about insulting the modesty of women rather than punishing sexual harassment. So first of all, you see in the language itself, the kind of biases underlying this. And secondly, I think one of the things we felt is that if you actually look at the number of cases for which motives are attributed and the total number of cases, there's a huge mismatch. So it's not very clear how these motives have actually been attributed. It seems to us that basically somebody in the National Crime Records Bureau has gone through this and has attributed motives sort of in a subjective fashion, right? And there's no information or transparency on how this process is undertaken, which makes the data even less credible in my view, because there's no explanation for how it's derived. The second issue is that it's not very clear whether a particular crime can have multiple motives, or if it's only a singular motive. And third, of course, is just seeing this as well as the next one. You'll see here, look at the list of motives again. Sexual exploitation, political motives, inciting hate crimes against community, inciting hate crimes against country, disrupt public services, right? So it's a data classification which is kind of a little bit apples and oranges. You can't quite, it's not comparing apples and apples, it's actually comparing a wide basket of fruits, in my opinion. It's not very clear what is the motivation of the person or the agency that classified this data. And I think what is even more questionable is that when we tallied up the numbers, we found that the biggest category of motives was called other, which basically 50% of cyber crimes were classified as other motives. And so again, to me, the question then becomes, how can you really treat as credible a system of data classification where the biggest element goes into the category which is actually supposed to be the smallest category, which is other, right? So it's yeah. But I think the other things that I wanted to talk about is we also looked at, apart from the table on motives, there was a new profile table that was introduced in 2014, which is for the first time, the National Crime Records Bureau tried to create a profile of persons who were arrested or accused in connection with cybercrime. And again, I'm projecting that right now. Now, again, the interesting points are, this was not done for any other kind of crime. So that itself, the fact that this kind of additional data is being created for internet-related crimes shows a certain underlying anxiety or a certain sort of underlying suspicion with relationship to the internet. And again, if you look at some of the classifications here, it's again a very odd schema. First of all, the people who are accused are divided into what are called foreigners and Indians. And it's not clear why this kind of classification is needed. Even more oddly, if you look at it, you'll find that under each head, there are new categories that are created. For example, column 4 has a category called the sexual freak. And the sexual freak is both like amusing and unethical and dangerous and highly biased. Because here's the interesting thing. Again, zero information. How do you arrive at this category? We have no idea. And we've tried talking to the National Crime Records Bureau and we cannot get any answers. So what this category means is absolutely like opaque. We have no idea, but does it mean, the second thing is I haven't been able to reproduce the whole table here, but what's interesting is if you add up, suppose you sort of deduce that perhaps sexual freak is something that derives from people who have been arrested on digital obscenity charges. And you try and then say, okay, how many people are under this category and how many people have been arrested under this provision? The numbers don't match at all. There's no relationship. So again, it seems like a very arbitrarily constructed category that criminalizes a certain kind of body, which is seen as dangerous in the mind of the state. And to this, I would again add the next column as well, which is cracker, hacker, or you see the casualness with which people are just being labeled cyber terrorist, right? So all these whole categories are just being created. And next to these are also like, again, equally subjective categories like employee, disgruntled employee. So again, I want to say that, how can one even take this kind of data seriously? And, there's so many questions that it overrides the value of the data itself. And this is, I'm showing you the same thing for Indian nationals, as it's called. But again, you'll see here that there are categories like persons with psychological disorder. What does that mean? Does that mean, like, what? Somebody with a... I don't even know what to say, to be honest, because I could ask like 85 questions on this alone. political person. What does that mean? Religious person. But to me, what is really sort of scary about this whole piece is that it applies only to internet-related offenses and not to the rest of the statistics that's collected by the National Crime Records Bureau. And again, when we looked at, how many of these actually add up, we again found that the vast majority are under other, which shows that actually the people who were doing the classification had no idea where to put them, right? So another element of subjectivity. So actually, to conclude, I just want to read out a couple of quotes, because we were looking at how, data has been theorized. And two of the really interesting things that we found was, one is actually a book by two informaticians. One is Jeffrey Bowker and the sociologist Susan Leigh Starr, who wrote a book called Sorting Things Out, which is one of the seminal works on how information is classified. And they talk about how each standard and each category valorizes some point of view and silences another. They go on to say, this is not inherently a bad thing. Indeed, it is inescapable. But it is an ethical choice. And as such, it is dangerous. Not bad, but dangerous. And to build on that, I want to actually quote another theoretician and actually a radical librarian from the United States. His name is Sanford Berman, and in the 1960s, he wrote a book called Prejudices and Antipathies, where he critiqued the United States Library of Congress catalog headings. And he actually wrote there that, there were certain sort of categories. For example, at that time, lesbianism and homosexuality were placed under sexual perversion. And he writes there again that, the referent smears and blemishes. The habits of gay and lesbian men and women may be different, but are not therefore more dangerous, disagreeable, or censurable than those of the heterosexual majority. And he goes on to say that the way in which the Library of Congress headings were done at that point of time was such that they dealt with people and cultures or humanity in such a way that it could only satisfy very, very parochial sort of points of view or worldviews, etc., and sort of, a very Orientalist kind of framing. The reason I want to end with these two quotes actually is just to say that I think if we were to look more deeply at the assumptions behind the ways in which cybercrime or internet-related offenses under the Information Technology Act in India are being collected, categorized, framed, and presented to an uncritical media and perhaps public, I think we would find very much similar assumptions that point to a worldview in which the internet is considered inherently something that provokes panic, anxiety, suspicion, and unease. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Bishaka. Suddenly, the Excel sheets and the headings themselves have become these very powerful ways of creating deviant subjects, and deviant kind of sexual subjects. I can't believe sexual freaks is a category. That's just amazing. What's a sexual freak? That's like computer geeks, right next to the sexual freak. Like spending too much time on your computer, you must be watching porn. Sexual freak. The end. But I think the thing that's sort of really is the most scary about that is actually what is it like, and then what, right? Like what else is it making? What is this data that's supposedly so neutral, so well collected, is actually then creating and causing? Vidushi, take us forward.
Almost ready. Okay, this is you.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Will that work?
It's not on the screen.
Oh, yeah, I know.
I was wondering.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Okay? Okay, great. Good morning, I'm Vidushi. I'm a legal researcher, and as Jack said, I'm a bit of a geek. I'm a lawyer who tries very hard not to be one. or to stay within the law, which you will see in my presentation. So I think the previous two amazing presentations really lead nicely onto mine. And like every researcher, my interest in this area started from a place of confusion, because surveillance and privacy and big data and increasingly AI mean everything, and hence I fear that they will start meaning nothing, because there's very little precision in the kind of conversations that we have about these technologies and these concepts. And so my real motive today is to talk about how do we begin thinking about all of these issues like surveillance and gender and big data and AI and every other technology that's going to save us all and is going to be the next big thing. How do we really break it down and try and understand it through a critical lens? And so I'm going to offer one particular critical lens and show how that maps onto issues of gender and data and surveillance. So when we talk about surveillance, I think it's important to think about how did we get here, right? So like how did we move from Foucault to a CCTV to big data, and how do we really break it down when we're looking at it from the point of view of doing advocacy or research? And so I like to break it down into three different phases. The first is an architectural phase of surveillance, the second is an infrastructural, and the third is contemporary conceptualizations of surveillance. So the first one is, of course, Bentham's panopticon. Like panopticism and panopticon are often like synonyms for surveillance, and there's a reason for that, which is he came up with this idea that you're being seen, but you can't see the one that sees you. So it's kind of like an illusion of constantly being watched. It's a technology of discipline, which means I will self-censor myself in order to seem a certain way so that the person watching me knows that I'm not doing anything wrong. And then Foucault took that and he came up with a lot of interesting ideas. The first one was, of course, panopticism, which is the type of power applied to individuals. But I think the more important ones and more relevant to this conversation is the idea of normation, where the norm is something we all need to aspire to. So if my GPS data is normal, then I'm safe from surveillance. But if I'm different from the norm or the ideal that I should be striving to, then I'm inviting surveillance into my life. And so we create this situation where we're all striving for this ideal, but we're not really questioning why we need to do that. And often we don't even really question why we're doing certain things. Like, why didn't you post that onto Facebook even though you typed it out? Because maybe that's not normal. Maybe it would invite certain kinds of comments or certain kinds of engagement into your life that you're not comfortable with. And also using discipline as a technology. And I'm sorry, the text is a bit, it's not really friendly for early morning reading, but we can roll with it. And so in this first phase, it's a very spatial concept. It talks about being seen and not being able to see the one that sees you. But when we move away from this first phase of architectural theories of surveillance and we move on to infrastructure, then we say, okay, it's not just about some prison guard looking at me. We're moving away from governments into companies. So it's not just a vertical relationship, but now surveillance has become a horizontal relationship. And also, it's not just about what I am doing, in my prison cell, but it's about all the representations of me that I'm leaving behind. So it's like my data points, it's my status, it's my locational information. So surveillance was first abstract. It was first a very physical concept, and now it becomes an abstract concept because I can't see when I'm being seen. It's creating this layer where I'm not able to really engage with the person that's seeing me. And then we move on to, post-panoptic surveillance. So this is, again, a very... Yeah, no, you probably can't read it. But that's a visualization to show how different forms of surveillance add to the Aadhaar system in India. So you have, your education and your school and your pension, which were all like small silos of data that existed previously. But now in this post-panoptic surveillance, they're all becoming part of one coherent whole. And so it's moving away from an architecture to an infrastructure. We're moving away from one point to a network of infrastructure that makes sense about me, which is a new vehicle for surveillance. And then we move on to this contemporary conceptualization of surveillance where we're inviting people. We ask people to follow our YouTube channel, like my status. I'm taking part in the surveillance. Like, I'm in Geneva, and I'm going to put up a picture on Instagram, and I want you to know that I am in Geneva in this particular place drinking this particular latte, and I'm inviting you to surveil me. And that becomes an incentive and not a problem. So we have different directions of surveillance and also different conceptualizations of surveillance. So I may not want a CCTV camera to see what I'm doing, but I want my friends and people who follow me on social media to know exactly what I'm doing. And as a researcher, I found this really problematic. Like, how do we break down the different types of surveillance that we think of? Like, is surveillance an ugly word? Because on Facebook, it isn't. On Facebook, it's great. And so how do we begin thinking about this from the point of view of gender and sexuality and stuff like that? So just in case this was a bit too much in the beginning, so you have phase one. It's architectural, spatial. It has centralized mechanisms, and it's about control. And then we moved on to phase two, which moved from institutions to networks. It increases the space between the person who's watching you and the person who's being watched. So it's a different kind of idea that we have there. And also we're moving on to disciplining people and controlling people. So this is a very interesting shift from a legal and technical perspective for me. And then we move on to phase three, which is we're combining the physical and digital. Surveillance has become this thing that we kind of invite. And it's peer-to-peer. It's not just governments, but it's corporations. It's combinations of the two, which we don't always know. We don't always know which corporation is working with which government to understand what about me. So you know, in the digital sphere, we have different layers of complexity, like I just mentioned. With social media especially, it's become many-to-many models of surveillance. So many people surveil many other people. They can belong to different parts of the government and stuff like that. I just wanted to share this video. I don't know if we can we play that video?
We can try, yeah.
Okay, it's gone to YouTube. So before it starts, I just want to point out that this is something that the ACLU came up with in 2003. And it was called Ordering Pizza in 2015. And this was at a point where, you know, we weren't all super excited about big data and AI. In fact, like, you know, it wasn't as cool as it is today. But just to have some perspective on how things don't really change, and also how much work we have going forward, I thought it would be good to share. But I don't know about the...
Just play it.
Is the sound on? I don't think the sound's on.
Yeah, the audio is probably not going to.
No, okay, that's okay. That's okay. You can just watch it. It's called Ordering Pizza in the Future. You can go onto YouTube and watch it. How do I get to my slide?
Yeah, we have a version of this which is a WhatsApp joke in Malaysia because we have biometric ID. So then it's like a text version, no? Like, hello, can I order a pizza? Then say, oh, give me your IC number. Oh, according to your IC number, you have heart issues, therefore you can only have this pizza. But then your credit rating is pretty bad, so you can only pay by cash. But then you don't have a lot of cash, so you can only have this cheap deal, and it just goes on and on and on. But it sort of explains like how this different collection of data sets comes together, and that video like exemplifies it quite well as well.
Sorry about that. No, that's okay. I mean, I was just trying to make a point that like these ideas have existed for a long time, and that we need to think about it not as a fashionable new concept, but as something that actually ties into all three phases that I spoke about. But because we're also short on time, I'd like to actually move ahead. Right, so then coming to this idea of surveillance and gender, how do we take all of these different phases and make sense of them in terms of gender? And I think that we also need to be critical of the different ways in which gender and surveillance play out. So it can be at the level of the body, where you're going through, you know, airport security and you're surveilled more than somebody who identifies with a certain gender because, you know, the technology that we've developed to scan us at airports only recognizes two binary genders, right? And unless you fit into this idea of the norm, what Foucault called normation, unless you're striving to be what is normal, you're inviting surveillance into your life. And that brings up the question of what should we do when we're building technology? What is this normation that we're trying to fight against? Like, is every deviant a bad deviant? Is, like that's a question that we need to ask at the level of building technology as opposed to when technology discriminates. And then, we make a fuss about it as we should, but at that point we're too late. So being aware of this impact on surveillance and gender at the time of building technologies to make them respectful by design, I think is a really powerful concept. The second, and this is a really sad concept that I wish I didn't have, but I do. So the search query here is South Indian masala, right? And masala is like spices that we use to cook and, spicy Indian food, and everybody knows about that. But if you look for that in Google, this is what you get, So it's like this idea of like these, I don't even want to say it, but like, spicy women, which is sad because it's not even like, machines pick this up on their own. There's somebody who's actually spending time and energy to label these kind of pictures as certain kinds of, to correspond with certain search results. And this leads to this question of, okay, in an age of big data, it's bad enough that we're collecting a lot of data. Usually, like, especially in India, we don't even have a privacy law, so there's no framework to secure against that. And then on top of that, we're feeding problematic data into the system. We're expending energy into doing this, and at the point at which technologies make sense of data that we give them, they're not going to have context, right? And so in this way, we kind of exacerbate existing misogynistic and problematic ideas in society, but we're not being critical at the time of building it. And so I think as people interested in this kind of work, we need to be more critical of, it's not just about the law and it's not just about policies, but it's at the point of when you're building technology, what considerations do we take into account? And this is, again, it's very small. I'm happy to share my slides after this. But basically what this is doing is talking about, so in India, the mobile phone is a form of control and power. It's a privilege. It's not something that everybody has. Often in rural India, especially, women aren't given cell phones. And in India, at the same time, we have this fintech revolution where they're like, we're going to save your lives and we're going to give you credit and a bank account and money. And so, sorry, I'm almost done. And they're making these promises about we're going to give you credit when no one else can. And what is the basis for that? Your data. But how do they use your data? They look at your location. Do you have a job? Do you leave the house every day? Do you go 6 times a week? Or do you go once a week? And if you look at this in terms of women in India, they're usually homemakers. They usually don't even have that data to make. Being a data subject then becomes a privilege in India because most people don't have phones. And that becomes part of the system, but we have no context at the time at which the algorithm is trying to decide whether you should get a loan or not. And this is a deeply gender-specific problem in India, but we're not thinking about it in terms of gender. We're thinking about it in terms of optimizing for money and, this fintech revolution is going to be great for everyone. But is it? Because it's only great for one particular gender and nobody else. Okay, I really don't have time, but there's also some research on safety apps. I'm very happy to share it. But I just want to make us all think about the different considerations we need to have when we're studying data, the body, and gender. And I think I should stop there, but I'm happy to share these slides with anyone who's interested. Thank you so much.
I'm so sorry to rush you. I think we sort of went from like, oh, we have a lot of time because no one is here, we can start a bit late, like, yeah, snowfall, to, oh my God, we have no time. And we have about like 10 minutes for a bit of a discussion, and I kind of wanted that. And I noticed that, Joanna Bryson, you've just joined us as well, and we wanted you to give an input, but if you can maybe, I think it will be good at this moment to sort of maybe open it up on the floor, to the floor, no? This is a huge universe, and I really liked what you said, like big data, AI, suddenly it becomes so big that it starts to mean nothing. And I think that's part of our struggle, which is how to make this mean something. And then there is this disparity between countries. I think you mentioned it. In developing countries, you sort of want to be counted. Like the call is, count me in. I want to be part of a data set. And then in developed countries, the call is, please don't count me. I don't want to be part of your data set. But then what you have is this huge disparity of people who have actually disparity already in access and control to technology resources being over-counted and over-decided upon. And you have biometric, on the other hand, as well, to become preconditions towards accessing economic, social, and cultural rights. no privacy protection or very little, to the other side that is then about stronger privacy protection, ownership and control over surveillance or data collection technology, and citizenship that says, don't count me. I do not want to be counted. So it's a kind of strange global discrimination that's also happening before you even go deep. So I think that's also part of the problematics that we are presented with today. So any thoughts, questions, comments, and so on, yeah.
Well, I really want to thank you for this, and I'm sorry I came late, because what I heard was fantastic. So I guess I was asked to speak because I'm known for AI bias, so I'm not going to talk about that. I want to talk about two things. One is that, speaking as someone who really does AI and knows about machine learning, the body is data. It's literally nothing you can do. It's not even this thing about how you project. We need to understand that the more data we have, the better models we build, the less data we need about each person. And so just these little snapshots are enough to make predictions about what you're going to do, which is a new concept of the self. We aren't usually used to thinking about how algorithmic we are, that people then can go out and make predictions about us. So this is huge for politics, and I really want to draw this in to the point that Vidishu, I'm so sorry, we know each other by Twitter, and I don't know how to say your name. But this thing that you were saying about that you want to project yourself to your friends, but not to the other people. And I really worry about this in particular when we shame academics for showing us that maybe they can make gaydar for their computer, and everybody says, oh my God, this is terrible, you shouldn't make gaydar on a computer. How can you do that? It's completely misunderstanding categories of humans, and it's unethical. And if you shame the academics, then you just push it out into industry and into politics. And we've seen what happens with that. We see this with the Cambridge Analytica. We see this with Trump and Brexit. And even if those things, but okay, I want to say something positive too. What we have to do about this is we do have to work with governance. This is what we have to do. We need to get to the point, we know that the police and the army can get into our houses, but still, if someone comes into our houses, we have a hope of organizing around protecting our house. We have to do the same thing with the data. And the EU does this, and I used to think this was wishy-washy nonsense, but they say, oh, if people use your data in ways you don't expect, then that's wrong. But you know what? Even though that sounds wishy-washy, this is the way by which the Brexit case is being prosecuted right now. That if people were using Facebook likes to identify and manipulate voters, then that may have been a violation of EU data regulations, and this may be one of the ways that the referendum will be challenged. So even these things that seem flaky, so engaging with government and figuring out how to maintain the utility of government is critical.
Thanks so much. Oh, gosh. How now? 5 minutes. Let's solve the problem of data governance. Come on. We have we'll give you 3 suggestions. Any other thoughts or questions? I mean, really just insights around this. I mean, I think this is such a big puzzle that we all probably hold a small piece of it, and any small piece, I think, will help to sort of map out what is this landscape we're talking about.
I'll do one more.
Let's see if there's...
Okay, it's the same.
No? There's a lot of puzzled faces. How are you feeling? Are you feeling okay?
Okay, this is completely different than the other 2 I just made, just so you have a third weird thing to worry about. One concern is that some people are so used to reconstructing their identity that they feel it's essential that we are allowed to do this through AI. And so I really find it concerning that some members of our community who are used to reconstructing their gender identity or other kinds of identities say, robots have as much rights as I do. And this is unfortunately, this is undermining human rights. We need to remember that AI is something that's made, it's a corporate artifact, and it uploads our information, right? So it just isn't the same as humans. So we need to stay human-centered, and I hope the whole community can agree to that.
Yeah. It's kind of funny, no? Like now we are trying to see, like, okay, AI has legal subjectivity. They are thinking and making, like, they are writing now Harry Potter chapters. It's terrible, but they're doing it. And therefore, it has the same kind of protections and legal rights. But at the same time, we're then saying, well, actually, maybe human rights doesn't even totally apply to human data sets. That is all problematic and so on. But you are looking at me as if you have something to say.
No, I'm just happy.
Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to just say something, because we've sort of got into this zone where we keep thinking about big data, artificial intelligence, etc., all of which is, of course, totally valid. I'm really curious how we will treat sort of little data going forward. Okay, and I want to give an example which really ties into sort of some of the surveillance stuff that you were talking about, Vidushi. So we've been doing workshops in India with teenage girls who are from low-income communities and therefore don't necessarily have smartphones. Some of them do, some of them don't. But what's interesting is if you ask them, what is your experience of surveillance? Guess what they say? Each and every girl we've spoken to says that every night when I come home, my parents check my phone. And my parents check three things. One is they check who's called me or who I've called, so call logs, if we think of call logs as data. Two, they check my messages, so SMSs if it's a feature phone, and then, and they check WhatsApp. And what's really interesting is it's totally related to gender and sexuality, because the parents are, not checking their son's phone. So if you have a brother and sister of exactly the same age or in the same age group, the brother's phone is not being checked. But the thing that the parents are trying to get at is, does my daughter have a boyfriend? Is she meeting guys, right? So it's so deeply connected actually with just sexuality in the most basic everyday sense of like romance and desire and stuff like that. And yet it's interesting to me because this is sort of like little data. So how does it fit into sort of our scheme of things and our understanding of sort of a data paradigm going forward?
Thank you for that. Yeah, big data, small data, efficient data. And do you want to just like have one little sort of summary and then I'll close? Yeah? Starting? Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot to say. I'm afraid it's not going to be a summary.
Find one.
Is it on?
Okay,
Yeah.
you can say, but just be aware people might leave. Yeah.
No, I'll actually take like 2 or 3 minutes. I think it's just really powerful, and I'm really glad you brought up the point of being a data set, because in India what we see is like women especially are adamant about getting enrolled in this Aadhaar system, which allows you to collect biometrics. It's surveillance in motion. I can't really get my biometrics out. You can use this to identify me in all sorts of ways. And the obsession comes from this fact that I am not a data subject. I am not a data file in your huge data set. Like, if I am starving tomorrow, I'm not going to get grains because you don't know anything about me. And I think that's also a really powerful and a really important thing to keep in mind, because when it comes to surveillance, when it comes to having the power of saying I don't want to be surveilled, there's one gender, or there's only one gender that has that power. And those are the men, because they leave their houses and they're the breadwinners. And, they, like Vishaka said, their phones aren't checked. But in terms of like studying this, I feel like we need to be more aware of cultural approaches to surveillance. Especially because surveillance occurs in very different ways in different cultural contexts. And one dominant narrative can't particularly fit on. Like a blanket approach, I think, will always fail when we're trying to understand privacy or surveillance, because these are deeply cultural and ethical questions that differ from place to place. And I think we really need to be mindful of that when we're thinking about the body and data.
Thank you.
That was short.
Super.
I'm proud of myself for that.
Okay, so continuing on the line of Vidushi, the technology, the way in which the data is collected is one fit to all. It comes from a specific place of power or a specific way of looking at. But then on the other side, there are all these culture specific, all the individual lives. So I think that this is also what is important when we talk about a frame of rights. because if we don't contest, we'll never change. And the one ideology is the one that is sold to government. So there are also governments of the South that are implementing very important and big, overwhelming projects that are using a specific way of looking and seeing and calculating. So I think that it's really important. As 10 years ago, we started to talk about online violence as effective violence. I think that we really need to talk about data as body, and if the body, those humans' body deserve rights, and we are not all equal, and not all voices are represented. So it's not only an issue of power, but it's really an issue of rights. Otherwise, data will remain in this quasi-neutral field. But they are bodies, and the billions of bodies that have been regulated and that been normalized, they are normalized even before they access the space. Because this is the wishing, I want to participate. If I do not participate, I do not exist. And you can see also for refugees and migrants, which with drones are heavily registered, recorded. The infrastructure of care that help refugees with small Wi-Fi, it's very fragile. But the infrastructure of registering people movement and displaced and migrants are really a big, huge part of our realities. They are heavily datafied. Their bodies are heavily identified. And if we add all the other specificity of these bodies on the move, then that's why we need rights. And we need to make a new run to make sure that data is really reflected as an issue of rights, personal rights.
Thank you. We're a little bit over time, but I think it's also really, it's been a really rich discussion that brings in all of these multiple layers. And for me, every time I get into this conversation about big data, it's always very helpful to start from, well, which body and whose bodies and what site are we talking about? And I always say, you know what, the body is flesh and the body is data, but the body is data. And the body is also this weird, almost like a materiality that far exceeds the materiality of the body in terms of time, space, representation, and decision. So how do we think about this in terms of governance at all of the different levels, no? In terms of infrastructure, in terms of technology, in terms of law and policies and existing landscapes of laws and policies, and what are the checks and balances already present, and how are we framing this from human rights, and then up to the point of interaction and content, and where does data actually sit with that? It's not quite content, not quite interaction, but it is about subjectivities, and it is about controlling a whole bunch of things, and being able to also, restrict and enable a whole bunch of things, and then access comes into the conversation, and we're talking about 50% of the world who has no access, but is being counted or not. So we leave you with this puzzle. Thank you very much for being part of this early morning conversation, and thank you to all the panelists.
I'm really sorry. I didn't even reach it into face that. No, it's fine. I just took too long in the beginning, and the meat of the presentation I didn't even talk about. Sorry.
You will be asked to write an article for gender IT.
Oh, cool.
Your presentation, because I think it's really
Now it's all. Mic is on. Just the mic is on.
Oh.
pretty easy to follow. I don't have a book yet. I keep doing this instead of writing. It's hard. It's hard to find the time. Yeah. The
Huh? No, no.
I only have like one card left. Do you mind to get pictures since you have your camera out?
Thank you.
I'm so sorry I didn't make it from the beginning. It's really embarrassing. I can't believe I committed to two things at once. But fortunately, there was a lot of my friends at the other place, and so I said, look, I have to go to this other meeting. Can you guys just tell me what happened? So they're like, yeah, okay. So. But yeah, you'll find that I have lots of stuff there, but if there's any confusion, the best way to get in touch is on Twitter, but even that's getting kind of hectic right now, but I do sometimes answer email. If I don't, just send it again in a couple of days. Like right now, I haven't been able to check mail for a few days. So this just happens.
So yeah, I just want to say thanks, and I will probably ping you at some point to kind of think through potentially, like, because my thing is how do we ask research questions in this, and I don't actually understand how the technology
I'm happy to work through that with you. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
What is where do you usually have it?
Where I
Live?
live in Malaysia.
Malaysia. Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm Malaysian, so
Yeah, cool.
so but now we are connected by email.
Yeah.
So
That's good.
Do you have one?
This is a great panel. That's such great speakers.
yeah,
I'm so sorry I missed.
I'm sorry we
I missed you. I think
I'm very happy that you made it, that we heard, and now we are in a loop.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. We're
Nice to see you. Hello, Barbara. Christina. Nice to meet you. Yes.
Good to sit here.
So, in fact, even sorry to slightly criticize you, but it's the people who create with the AI. It's not that machines are creating. I mean, in a way, it is. And this is, again, you guys are better situated than a lot of technologists to understand this. It is a social construction, how we decide to attribute this. But because there's no way for us to hold machines accountable, we have to keep humans as accountable. So we just need to. It is like it's a practice.
There
Remember,
isn't one.
it's never the AI that did it. It's somebody's done
There
this
is a
with
clicker,
AI.
but we're going to put your presentation
AI is
here, and you can come to this.
Yeah, of course. There's always another.
Yeah.
There's always another. Okay.
Thank you so much.
What is the name of it? This is cloud computing, right? Yeah. Cloud computing. Okay. Prepared.
Barbara, you're moderating, right? And I give this to
Have one more.
This is the last presentation.
Okay.
And I was wondering, would I need to? Oh no, it's on screen, so I will be seeing the presentation from there.
Yeah, it's going to be screened over here from this computer, but we don't have a clicker, so you have to. Sorry. When it's
Say
your
next
turn,
slide.
just or come
Or
here
move
if you
here.
want to.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's fine.
whatever.
Yeah, I can move here. And from here, can I also have the option of, even though it will be displayed in full slide, to be checking my notes?
Yeah, you can. I guess. Do you have the notes or on the little computer, or you want them up here?
They are so on the PowerPoint underneath.
Ah,
you know.
okay. Yeah.
I mean,
Let
we can
me
try it out.
see. Okay, this means out. And then this one. Do you want to test it? Go ahead. Okay. We're going to move an extra chair in here.
Okay. So I can move.
Is there
everything? Okay, it's not possible, I think. But there must be a setting.
Yeah.
So see, because it shows exactly what you have here. So it shows exactly what's on the screen. It's projected there.
Yeah.
But within your slide sorter, I doubt it will be read area. authorized as manager.
Good morning. Welcome to our session with the Open Forum with the Joint Inspection Unit on Cloud Computing in the UN system. My name is Jovan Kurbali. I am Director of Diplo Foundation and Head of Geneva Internet Platform. And we organized this session in cooperation with the Joint Inspection Unit with the main idea to initiate discussion on the report that Joint Inspection Unit is likely to prepare next year on cloud computing and United Nations. It is the major challenge for all organizations, including the UN, how to manage data and how to approach this question of cloud computing from different technological, legal, organizational perspective, question of immunities and privileges. And this is the context in which we organize today's session. It will be followed by the quite a few sessions on the other issues related to data. We'll have panels on data and e-commerce, data and human rights, data and standardization, and we'll send the link to the whole series of events related mainly to the question of data and United Nations. And we are really fortunate today to have with us the panelists, excellent panelists who will approach the question of data